welcome to our community Bible study. This will be for Thursday, July the 29th. And we are continuing studying in Genesis. The title today is Abraham's Promise. And we're going to read from Genesis chapter 12, 13, and 15. In Genesis 12, we have the story of Abram. And I may use the words interchangeably, but right now he's still called Abram, which was his given name. He was later named by God Abraham. But Abram was going to Egypt because there was a famine in the land. And Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me but let you live. So say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." Now, I don't know about you, but this is the year 2021, and the idea that he was so afraid of losing his life that he would pass his wife off so that she could be with somebody else to save him sounds despicable. I have no other word for it. However, it tells us something about the role of women and their status in those days, and for a good part of history, where they were not equal to men, and considered more like property than anything else. And no matter how you justify this, no matter what covenant that God had made with Abraham and the trust that he had, sometimes Abram's trust was strong, and here it was not. His fear took over. So, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians indeed saw that Sarah was a beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But, always pay attention when you hear the word but. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarah. Well, Pharaoh figured out what was going on. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? So then, here is your wife back. Take her and go." And there's an exclamation point, and this is as strong a statement as you'll see. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. Well, I've already mentioned about this telling us some things about the role of women in history. And I think it's pretty bad when Pharaoh comes across as being a more admirable character than Abram. And yet, great people of faith have their weaknesses. And they may seem obvious to you and I, but they're not always obvious to the person who has those weaknesses. I believe that we all have our shortcomings. And so sometimes when I read about Abram and others, it reminds me that, okay, I do have shortcomings, and that's true of everyone. And yet God was still honoring his covenant to Abram. I think it's interesting. I did a little research to see the timeline of Egypt and the timeline of when Abram lived. And what I realized was that when Abram went to Egypt, the Great Pyramids of Egypt and the Sphinx had already been built. Wow. They were older than that. from about 3,000 to 2,000 years before Christ was the Old Kingdom, and that's when those pyramids and the Sphinx and things were built in and around that area, because that was the capital. The capital of Egypt shifted a couple of other times. And we think Abram lived around the year 2000 BC. And then, of course, there was another era in Egypt after that. But I just thought it was interesting that when Abram went, Abram and Sarah and all of their family, that Egypt already had constructed those pyramids. Egypt, you realize, was a long civilization, stable more than many others, probably because of the Nile River and the ability to feed their people, and to they were sort of isolated, but not any more than anywhere else. So anyway, that was Abram in Egypt. Genesis chapter 13. And this is about Abraham and Lot. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, which is the desert southern end of what we would now call Israel. And he went with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. Let's pause for a moment, because I think that it is significant that no matter what happened with Abram, it seems like he and his clan flourished. The promises of God about him being the father of a great nation, although had not yet been realized in terms of children and descendants, but he and his clan were certainly becoming a great clan with strength and wealth, even when he was in Egypt. So he came back here to the Negev. Verse 3, from the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Remind you that there are a few places that are still there today and that we recognized and that have been significant over periods of times. Bethel is one of those places. It is, you can go there today. It is a little bit north of Jerusalem in what is now part of the Palestinian West Bank. I'm not sure what it looks like today, but I know in about 30 years ago, there are people living there, but the terrain is pretty rocky and hilly. And so the place where Abram built an altar was between the two hills of Bethel and Ai. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. Plus, the Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So there was just not enough grass and food and space for all of these animals and that were there, the flocks and herds of Abram and Lot and the others. Verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Well, what a good thing. They sat down and they worked it out instead of just quarreling and letting that conflict continue. And as someone recently reminded me, boy, we could use a good dose of just sitting down and remembering to do that when we have arguments or difficulty or conflicts with others. This shows also Abraham's trust in God, I think. because he didn't try to pick the best land. He offered Lot to choose. And if Lot chose the best land, Abram, I believe, was trusting that the Lord would provide no matter what, because he was doing the right thing. Verse 10, Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan, down by the Jordan River, towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was, of course, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. On the next page, if you have the study guide, you will see, if you can read the tiny print, where Jerusalem and Hebron and Bethel are. And basically Abram is on the west side of the Jordan River, which is what we today would call Israel. And Lot went to the side of the Jordan Valley that is mostly today the Kingdom of Jordan, and perhaps way down at the south end of the Dead Sea. There are some rivers and creeks that run into the Dead Sea from there, and we think that that's a possible location of the cities of Sodom, Gomorrah, and several of the others. So that's the area that Lot was in. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had departed from him, look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I'm giving it to you. So Abram went to live, he went a little bit further south, to the great trees of McRee at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Now, Hebron is there today. The land near McRee that he claimed is his land is recognizable today, and there is the tomb of the ancestors that is there today. There's a monument above the caves and tombs, and it has been there for centuries. And it is believed that Abraham and Sarah and a number of, for a couple generations, several others of the patriarchs are buried there. If you took a tour of Israel today, you might be able to visit. Our tour bus, when I was there 30 years ago, drove by, and they said we really couldn't get out and tour very much of it because there was a little bit of unrest. Well, today, there's more unrest. And so I don't know if you would even be able to tour and get there. But it is interesting because it is one of those places where it is, we know is the exact same place as what they were talking about here. So that is Abram's claimed property and land there. So chapter 15, the Lord's covenant with Abram. It's interesting that we have that covenant repeated, the words of that repeated several times. I don't know about you, sometimes I need things to be repeated for me to remember. And of course, this is over a period of years, and God still is renewing and reminding Abram of his covenant, even though much of it had not yet been realized. So chapter 15. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Protector and a reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son, who is your own flesh and blood, will be your heir. The Lord took Abram outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And then verse 6 is the famous one. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So at the pinnacle of Abram's faith, we have God calling him righteous because of that. Verse 7, then he also said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? He wants some assurance. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. This was the sacrifice.
Thank God for the new covenant.
Made to the Lord, yes. You know, Steve, you're right about that. I looked up a little bit about sacrifices in ancient Israel because this is really foreign to most of us here today. Now, what I read was mostly about the sacrifices that Leviticus describes that was used in the temple in later days, but many of them really apply here to what Abram has done. Part of this was indeed a burnt offering, and the idea was that whatever the animals were that were sacrificed were transformed into the smoke would have been a pleasing odor that went up to the Lord in heaven. And many times sacrifices were where part of the animal would be burned and then the rest would be saved for food. And later, that is how, when there was the temple in Jerusalem and there were priests there, that is how they often got food was by the sacrifices that were came. Or people would bring in grain offerings or the first fruits of a harvest, so that you weren't offering to God the leftovers, you were offering a portion of what was best. And some of that might be burnt, and some of that might be then some of it was also remained so that one could have a meal from that as well. But the idea of these burnt offerings was they were a smoke that would rise up and be a pleasing odor to God. One of those ways that human beings feel and have a connection, the earthly and the divine, the human and God. The place of Bethel was one of those spots, because years later, Jacob, that's where he's going to be, where he has that dream of the angels coming up and down the ladder and the stairs to heaven. We build cathedrals and churches and monuments and things, often with that rise up so that you look up and it's part of this sort of connection. Now, we also have connections when we feel in prayer and in times together where those are moments. Sometimes we call places holy because that's where those experiences are. And so part of the sacrifice, although some of this just sounds kind of yucky to me, but is part of this is one way that they were able to connect with God. So back to verse 12. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. kind of like a bad dream. Then the Lord said to him, know that for certain, for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. They'll be enslaved and mistreated. Talking about their time in Egypt. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they'll come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And so when the sun set and darkness falling, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Raphaites, I didn't say that right, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So no matter who else was living in those lands, God promised them to Abram. And that's the end of the chapter. You know, it's interesting, God's covenant with Noah and all creation was about never destroying the earth again with a flood. God's covenant with Abram is that he will have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the dust on the ground, and also that Abram would have the land of Canaan where they could all live. It was his covenant that was yet to be completely fulfilled. But no matter what happened with Abram, it seems like his life, his tribe, his clan grew, all their possessions in influence, and Abram became a great man who then later we will learn some more about Abram next week. Next week we'll talk about Abram and Sarah and whether or not they do have a child who will be the descendants. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.